Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today, with it being a very busy holiday season, we're bringing you a much more casual conversation between John and I, where we talk about two of our more recent cases, which have had some big developments over the past month or so. Today, we'll be talking about the confessed killings of Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy, as well as the discovery of the late Robert Hoagland, aka Richard King.
So, big news over the past few cases.
Big news over the past few cases. So we wanted to wait a little bit before putting out this update for everyone. We had a feeling there would probably be more information that came out over the few weeks since this news dropped on two different cases that we've covered. So more information has come out and there is more to discuss. So we're going to start out this episode by discussing Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy's cases and the update that came out and kind of John and I's reactions to that and, you know, how we felt seeing that news. And then we'll move on to Hoagie's case and give you guys the updates on what has been going on in his case. So for Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy, we had done an episode titled Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Dorothy Anderson, and the Cottingham Theory. So when we discussed those cases, we believed that Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy's cases were more than likely connected. Police said that. Dorothy Anderson's was one that you couldn't necessarily discount as potentially being connected, even though authorities said, we don't think so.
Yeah, Dorothy was from the same area as Laverne.
Mm-hmm.
So all these murders happening within close proximity, close timeline. It's like, okay, there's definitely a possibility there, but the two that we were definitely sure that were more than likely connected were
Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy.
Right.
So basically, the timeline of when we put our episode out was...
Well, let's back up a little bit.
Okay.
You're the researcher. You're the one that dives into all these articles and everything.
Yep.
Where did you see it mentioned? How did you see it mentioned? How often was it mentioned that Cottingham could have been linked to these two cases that he has since confessed to?
So I had only found a handful of articles because I said it in the episode as well. Mary Beth Hines was a case that I had been interested in for a while. And then once I dove into her case, I recognized that there was this connection to Laverne Moy. And then, you know, I also saw the information about Dorothy Anderson. And there wasn't much reporting. It was just like these cases had barely ever been covered. There was a very small amount of coverage on them.
But are you saying that while researching Mary Beth's case, there was an apparent link to Laverne's?
Correct. It was stated like when it first happened.
But it wasn't necessarily also linked to Cottingham.
Not in the beginning, no, because nobody knew who Cottingham was at that point. So both Mary Beth and Laverne were killed in 1972. And Cottingham was not arrested until 1980.
For crimes unrelated to these two women.
Correct. And he was murdering women from like the late 60s through till 1980. And he ended up arrested in the middle of committing another or attempting to commit another murder. And at that point, I don't know if anybody had put two and two together back then. I think it was once that detective and the doctor got involved, and then one of the victim's daughters got involved with him, and they started like working through to try and get these confessions. And over the last, you know, I would say maybe decade, half a decade to a decade, they've been working with him, and he's slowly but surely been confessing to these other cases. Then you would see an article here or there in recent years saying things like, there are so-and-so amount of cases in Nassau County that are being re-reviewed as having the potential of being related to Richard Cottingham. And one particular article that I found mentioned Mary Beth and Laverne as two of those cases. So from there, that's when I said, okay, this is interesting. I don't know anything about Richard Cottingham. Obviously, he's been in prison for 40 plus years at this point, but let's dive into him and see if we can make a connection. And lo and behold, we made a connection, and there wasn't an update for like months. I think the last update with that article that mentioned those things was from like August. And then, we put out the episode at the end of November, and then the first week in December is when the DA had the press conference held to say, yes, in open court this morning, 6 days after we released our episode, Richard Cottingham confessed to the murder of Diane Cusick, who we had discussed in the episode, along with 4 additional murders, Mary Beth and Laverne being 2 of the 5 that he confessed to in total.
Yeah. Were there people that had made that possible connection before the more recent articles came out? Or was it kind of, the recent articles came out, you found out that Cottingham was talking to the doctor and these other people about these cases, and they kind of made the connection there? Or like, what's the timeline on that? Did people say, oh, Cottingham probably did this in the forums, is what I'm trying to get at?
These cases aren't discussed in forums. I normally can find maybe, a handful of Reddit threads or Web Sleuths threads on the cases that we cover. However, there are definitely ones that are less reported that people just don't know about. Therefore, people on forums just aren't talking about them. And this was one of those cases where I could not find a Reddit thread or a Web Sleuths thread. And I will not come out and say, that nobody's ever made that connection before and that, people aren't talking about that. And for all I know, there could be forums out on the internet that I don't even know anything about.
Yeah.
But based on my research and what I was able to find, I didn't see anybody putting 2 and 2 together there. So
outside of those official articles saying,
yes,
we're trying to tie Cottingham to Nassau County murders.
Correct.
And then you saw that these 2 women were killed in Nassau County, and you were like, okay, let me look into this a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then later on, I know we had mentioned it in the episode, but there was some type of connection with Cottingham and Nassau County during that time period. And then it's like, okay, not only has this guy been killing women from like the 60s on until he got caught, but he was in the area around the time, and, it fits his MO of killing.
Not really having an MO.
Right.
Yeah. And that Nassau County case was Diane Cusick. So once you put 2 and 2 together there to say, because I think we mentioned this in the episode too, that he did not really seem to frequent the New York area in the late 60s, early 70s. Most of his crimes seemed to be in the New Jersey area, which is where he was living. But once you were able to make the connection of how he could be connected to that area, at the very, least, it was Diane Cusick. And then from there, even if there hadn't been those articles mentioning Mary Beth and Laverne, I think just knowing that he had been in Nassau County, that would have still been something that intrigued me to say, let me do more of a dive into this guy.
And something else that we mentioned, just to reiterate, is that Cottingham is not this guy that you can just give him little tidbits of information and he's going to come out and he's going to confess to something. We had talked about how you really have to get him talking about how things were back then and where you got, what was it, the best pastrami sandwich or something like that.
Yep.
So for the people that ended up working towards getting him to confess to these, this was something that they couldn't just go in and say, hey, did you do this? They really had to work hard at it. And luckily enough, he found a way to make the connection and to say, yeah, I did this, I did that. And then once the confession was made, we actually got even more information. We found images that weren't posted anywhere else because you had family members coming forward providing, photographs of their loved ones that Cottingham had killed.
Yeah, so I mean, if you guys had noticed our social media posts, because Laverne Moy and Dorothy Anderson have never really been talked about online outside of like the very early days of like when this first happened, outside of a few articles about Mary Beth with like a mention of Laverne, there were no photos. So the only photo that I had available to use was one of Mary Beth. So the great thing now, and I know, you know, it's a double-edged sword. Like, this is a great thing, but it's also a sad thing. But it's great that now, you know, we can put a face to a name for at least Laverne. And we have a photo of her, and I'll put it on our website and our socials so that you guys can see it and you can, you know, get to know who she was a little bit more. Her son had come out and spoken at the press conference. I'm pretty sure there's a video of the press conference on the YouTube channel of the Nassau County DA. Highly recommend checking that out. But it's just really awesome to see, like, now there's more talk about these women. And also, I don't know, you know, if people follow us on social media, but I was starting to get really pissed off when these cases were first, you know, being talked about in the media again, because so many people were writing these articles like, who is the torso killer? Who is Richard Cottingham? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, but no one gives a shit who Richard Cottingham is. Right. And if you do, I think that's a problem. What I want to see is, who was Mary Beth Hines? Let's learn more about her life. Who was Laverne Moy? Let's learn more about her life and her son and her daughter and all these family members. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that just aggravates me to a whole nother level, but that's just a conversation for another time. But I did also want to mention, because Richard Cottingham did not just confess to Diane Cusick, Mary Beth Hines, and Laverne Moy's cases. There were 2 additional that he confessed to as well. So the other women that Cottingham confessed to killing were Sheila Hyman and Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves. And I want to put out like a plug, I guess, to everybody listening to say, Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves does not have family that's come forward yet. And at the press conference, the DA and the other families, and there have been update articles on this as well after the fact, but people are reaching out to the public, trying to see if there's anybody from her family in the area that can come forward and, you know, say, hey, I'm her sister, I'm her brother, I'm whoever, just so that, you know, her family can be alerted of the news that we at least know who her killer was, and, you know, maybe they have more information about Maria. So we're just trying to find her family. So I would say, if anybody is listening that knows Maria's family, that is Maria's family, you know, reach out to the Nassau County Police Department at 516-573-7524.
Yeah, and I think a comment you made earlier about being a double-edged sword, how it's like, obviously these murders were a terrible thing that happened, but you now have closure for the families. Mm-hmm. And now, because we have a little bit more information, you can learn more about the victims.
Yep.
And there was a quote at the bottom of the New York Times article that kind of went over the press conference and all that. And I guess it was Mr. Moy, so I assume that's probably her son.
Laverne's son. Yep.
He had said something that I think encapsulates something like this as well as it can be.
Yeah.
And he said, there's been some dark days, Mr. Moy said, but today the sun shines brightly because justice has been served. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, you know, that holds true for a lot of these cases that have gone unsolved for so long, that finally, thanks to the work put in to get Cottingham to remember and confess to these murders, mm-hmm. was time well spent. And finally, these families that have been, you know, struck by tragedy get some closure. And like Mr. Moy said, justice was served.
Yeah, I completely agree. And for anyone that might be questioning, you know, a serial killer who has touted the fact that, like, he has killed anywhere from 85 to 100 women, and, you know, he's trying to seem like this big man because this is this horrible thing that he's done, but he's not like a Henry Lee Lucas that's out here confessing to everything, and he clearly has no ties to the area or anything like that. It was stated in a few different articles, as well as I believe in the press conference as well, that he had family in the Nassau County area and he did frequent there regularly. And he apparently knew details of the crimes that only the killer would know. So I think that's huge. And I think, you know, that goes back to a conversation I feel like we have all the time about police holding information close to the chest. So, like, in one respect, yes, it's a little bit annoying, like we just talked about in Mary Morales's case. However, in a case like this one, I am sure there were little tidbits that police did keep to themselves, whether it be something they found at the crime scene, whether it be something that Cottingham had done to his victims that only he would have ever remembered and only he would know. And authorities have said he was able to provide those specifics, so they are confident that he's not just confessing willy-nilly, that these are things that only he would know. So it's near positive that he is the one.
Yeah, I mean...
Plus, DNA in Diane Cusick's case, you really can't.
Right, and it seems like all of his victims were strangled for the most part, and there was some commonality with that. I think the difference in Mary Morales's case versus this one is, even with these other victims that weren't necessarily linked to Cottingham from the get-go, there was still more information put out about cause of death, autopsy reports, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whereas in Mary Morales's case, there's like nothing put out, and there is more that can be released that wouldn't necessarily be something only the killer or a person involved would know.
Yeah, I agree. Now, before we move on to the next case, I wanted to touch on one more aspect of the Cottingham confessions. When speaking in reference to Maria Emerita Rosado Nieves, Mary Beth's sister, Jeannie, was quoted in the Mineola, New York Patch as stating, quote, "I received so much peace knowing what happened to my sister Mary Beth that I feel compelled to assist the Nassau County Police Department in their search for her family," end quote. And this quote stood out to me for two reasons. One being that Jeannie now has peace, but the other, which is really touching, is that she's not distancing herself from what happened now that she has her peace, but instead she wants to continue to help other families affected by Cottingham's crimes. So again, if you have any information for the Nassau County Police Department, you can contact them at 516-573-7524.
Obviously, it was a great day. It was an emotional day when this press conference hit because it was so unexpected.
It really was.
And it was like so fresh in our minds because it was a case that you just finished researching. We just finished recording the episode and producing and releasing the episode. And then to get like that type of closure so quickly after releasing an episode was just bizarre.
It really was.
But the bizarrity doesn't stop there.
It does not, no. Because, you know, we were reeling from this on, it was December 5th, I believe, that the press conference came out. So it was the Monday. And John and I were already essentially done with our next episode, which was on Robert Hoagland's case, a.k.a. Hoagie. And we were releasing part one the following day.
Yeah, it was a very long recording. It was like a 3-hour long recording. So we were like, generally we like to keep our episodes under 2 hours. So if we can't do that with one episode, we'd rather split it because it's hard to dedicate your time to a 3-hour episode.
Oh, absolutely.
And having recorded everything already, we released the episode on Tuesday, or part one on Tuesday. And then the next day,
the news that Hoagie was found was released. So literally within a 3-day span of time, John and I are like, what is happening? These cases are getting solved back to back, essentially.
Right.
And it's like, what are the odds of this timing? The first one, it was like, all right, that's a coincidence. Very, very glad that this is now solved. We were really, really pleased to see that. And then to hear the news essentially the next day, we were like, okay, this is just freaking strange. Like, how does this happen? What are the odds with the timing? And for everyone that doesn't know, we expressed what the update was in several sentences at the end of part 2 of Hoagie's case, but he was found deceased. No foul play indicated. It seemed as though it was of natural causes, but living in his new home in Rock Hill, New York, under an alias of Richard King. And he had completely left his life behind and started brand new.
Yeah, so we're talking about, you know, a middle-aged man that was described as a dedicated family man that had one son still living at home battling addiction. He had a rough patch with his wife for a little while, but they were working things out. They were living together. He was supposed to be picking his wife up from a vacation, you know, the next day after he was last seen. And to learn that he up and left his life behind for the second time in his life, which we talked about, but was living this new life only like 2 hours away in New York. So from Connecticut to New York, he's not moving across the country. He's not fleeing to Mexico or Canada or something like that. Just, you know, living his life and found a roommate he could live with without providing a ton of documentation.
He had no ID.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah, so the biggest thing for us with this case is, you know, we had seen that people had put out updates if they'd, you know, covered the case previously. And we wanted to wait a little bit just to let things sink in, kind of, you know, let the initial shock of knowing that this is what happened kind of wear off a little bit.
Yeah, marinate in it for a little while because you know once the story breaks, that's not all the info. You know that more is going to drip out and come out to the public later on. So,
which it did based on a Times Union article written by Philip Pantuso, Lana Bellamy, and Christine Dempsey. And it appears as though any number of these journalists interviewed Richard King, a.k.a. Hoagie's roommate, and got a lot of information about what things were like when he first met him and what his life had been like over the past decade. And it's just wild to see how close to the truth Robert Hoagland stayed with what he told this new roommate.
Right. Robert Hoagland was going by the alias Richard King. He found a roommate, moved in with this guy, started a job as a real estate appraiser with a fake name, like no documentation.
No licensure to be able to do it.
Which is so strange to me because I would assume as a real estate appraiser, you got to go through all this accreditation stuff. You got to, you know, link your identity to a license, not like a driver's license, but like a real estate license somehow, I would assume.
Yeah.
So we find out that he's living this other life. He moved in with this guy. He's paying him month to month, whatever. Things seem a little weird, but they kind of just work through whatever, and they're living together for a while. And Hoagie, a.k.a. Richard King, pretty much told this guy his whole life story without taking any liberties of, like, changing it up a little bit.
Yeah, it was weird. Like, he said, I had just separated from my wife, and I have 3 children, and he explained, like, what his kids were going through, and that he was starting brand new, and he just essentially left everything behind, which is exactly what he did.
Right, and he talked about South Carolina.
Yeah.
Like, he really didn't leave much out.
He didn't.
And we're also saying this, like, you have David, which was Hoagie's roommate. This is like him talking to a publication, just stating what he remembers.
Yeah.
So you would have to assume that Hoagie told him probably everything. And we talk about this a lot of times when we are covering investigations and you have people, maybe persons of interest or suspects, that are being interviewed. And we talk about how it's easier to tell a lie that has some shred of truth to it because at least you can cling to that.
Yep.
Well, I mean, what's easier to cling to than the truth? So, sure, his name is Robert Hoagland, but to this guy, he was Richard King, but still lived the same life as Robert Hoagland. So Richard King was married but separated, had 3 children, one battled with addiction, had a son that lived in South Carolina. Like, it's so weird that all he did was just change his name in that story, but still told pretty much his whole life story.
Yeah, and there's a quote here from David in this Times Union article that states, quote, he said he was divorced, his children were adults, and he was just looking to start a new life. So I was able to kind of help him out, end quote. And the other interesting thing, and it says this a couple paragraphs beforehand, is that when Hoagie had moved in with David, all he had with him were some clothes, he says, quote, some accessories, and a small bed. I bet you $600 could buy that.
Probably. And we had mentioned it. It's like, you don't think that somebody would up and leave their life unless they were stashing some money over some period of time. That way they have like a little nest egg.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that Hoagie had left his wife thousands of dollars in the safe.
Mm-hmm.
He had taken that $600 out. We had alluded to maybe trying to buy the laptops back.
Yep.
But we never know what happened with that $600. So
We don't.
that $600 could have been on top of anything else that he was kind of putting on the side, getting ready to make his exit from his life.
Yes. And as I'm, scrolling through this Times Union article, because it is the most in-depth that has been done since this news was publicized, but Robert Hoagland looks no different than he did when he went missing.
No, I mean, a little bit heavier.
A little bit
A
more
little bit more
hair.
facial hair. Sometimes glasses, but who knows if he wore those in his regular day-to-day life.
Yep. But how is it that this case, even, from 2013 to 2016, okay, I can understand if someone from Connecticut wasn't in the New York area and ended up spotting this guy. But you have to think, once the Disappeared episode aired, they've got a lot of viewers.
Right.
So the fact that not one single person ever recognized that this was Robert Hoagland is mind-boggling to me because he looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I mean, if he had gained 50 pounds and grew his hair out or wore a toupee or did something, grew this massive beard,
Right.
yes, I could say, all right, I can understand and I can see how someone might have had a hard time deciphering that this was this man. But to me, if I saw this guy walking down the street after having covered his case, I would have said 100%, there he is. I can spot this guy. I can tell that this is him. And it's just crazy to me that he was able to do this in 2013.
Right. It's not like it's 1970 when technology isn't really a thing and there's not surveillance cameras all over the place. And, back in the 70s, there probably weren't shows like Disappeared where you had nationwide coverage, essentially, or a nationwide distribution, putting this guy's face on everybody's TV that was tuning in.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild, but something that I mentioned during the episode.
I knew you were going to bring it up.
It just rubbed me the wrong way with those surveillance pictures when he went into the gas station and he looked right at the friggin' camera and had a big smile on his face. That just, for some reason, it caught me. It rubbed me the wrong way. It seemed like he was not up to no good, but maybe scheming some way. Like if you just look at a picture and you have to try and make a judgment call on something.
Yeah.
It seemed like something wasn't right. Knowing a little bit of background with that, but then seeing that image and then finding out he's just like, up and vanished. It's like, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
And we talked about, he would have a great skill set to be able to go and do stuff outside of the public's eye. Like if you wanted to be a chef somewhere, or if you wanted to be doing whatever, but to find out that he was a real estate appraiser, like he's got to be face to face with a lot of people to do his work.
Yes.
So
you go into their house, you take pictures of their house.
Right.
Like what?
So not only did David, who maybe wasn't into true crime stuff, he didn't watch Disappeared, he never tuned into that stuff. David didn't know, but then everybody that this guy came in contact throughout his daily life had no idea either. And then through his work and intimate type conversations in somebody's home and talking to them and all that, nobody knew. And I still don't know how he even got that job.
No, me either.
That's like, if I wanted to go be a real estate appraiser right now, I assume that I have to do some type of course. I have to get some type of license. I have to prove my identity. Did David help him get this job? Because he said he helped him out.
No, he had the job already when he met him. So that's what I'm wondering too, because there's that gap of time. So he went missing in July, and it stated that he had been living in Rock Hill, New York since November. What was he doing in the in-between? Who did he meet? I mean...
What did he do for money?
Yeah, and the thing that I can understand that sometimes there are people out there who will pay you under the table and don't give a shit who you are. It's like, oh, whatever.
I think that's very common in service jobs.
Yeah, like if it were a chef or a waitress or something.
Which is why I thought that would be great for him, because he could go work in a kitchen anywhere. He could be a friggin' dishwasher if he really needed to. But he's working away from the public. He's always in the back. The only people that know him are the people that are paying him, really, and the other people that work with him.
But he's like face to face with these people, and then it even goes on to say in this article that he volunteered at a soup kitchen.
Right.
Like face to face with all these people.
Hiding in plain sight.
Hiding in plain sight is exactly right. And, I just feel for his family because, and they said it too, like at first I didn't see anything about them coming forward with any comments, but I did see a handful, specifically from his son Chris, that said, we're just so confused.
Yeah, I think that almost hits harder than saying, we're sad.
Yeah.
Because we're confused kind of makes you put yourself in their position, and it's like, my dad, who I thought loved me and, came down to South Carolina, didn't he help him out with a car?
Oh, he said it in here. They worked on cars together, I think.
Yeah. So, you have this established relationship over however many years, and then for your dad to just up and leave, confused, hurt, sad that he's dead, happy that you
have
what
answers,
happened.
Sort of.
Yeah, confused is the right word, I guess.
It is.
It really makes you feel for them.
It does. And obviously we feel for all the families of situations like this. And, it was very interesting for John and I to go back because we obviously found out about this news prior to part 2 coming out, which was already recorded. We had recorded everything all together prior to part 1 coming out and then just separated it. So part 1 was done, part 2 was recorded, and then literally the next day we find out about this. So then going back, listening to our conversation and, if you've listened to part 2, I was originally on the foul play bandwagon, and John essentially convinced me that it was very, very, very possible that he could have left his life behind.
Right.
And it was just very strange. It was like this out-of-body experience to listen back to our conversation knowing the outcome.
Right.
And
it did give a little shred of affirmation to us, though, that we're not off the right track on, this one in particular, 2 cases in particular.
Yeah.
We have the Cottingham theory, which you made the connection through your research and stuff like that, and it was like, yeah, this is definitely possible. Proven that it was.
Yeah.
Then we have Hoagie. You come into it, and we talk about this, where it's easy to come to a conclusion, but then when you bounce ideas off somebody else, you may change your opinion on things because maybe you talk about something that you didn't really think about and you see it from a different perspective. But then we talk about Hoagie, and I think at the end of it, we both landed on the idea that he very well could have up and left his life because we really had no evidence of foul play.
There wasn't. There really wasn't.
There was a pattern that he had left before. He had all this drama going on with Max. He could have had depression because he was taking his blood pressure medication, and that's one of the side effects. We know that there was a rough patch going on with his wife. That may have been worked through, but who knows? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Right? He did it again, and to leave his family wondering about that for so long.
For a decade.
Yeah,
oh my God, that is just horrible. And honestly, and we talked about this too at the end of part 2, I'm pretty sure, regarding Max and how people vilified him and made him out to be this monster, saying oh, he could have killed his dad and transported him and done this and done that. And it's like, guys, this is why, especially at the beginning of a case, in the early days of a case, you need to keep the speculation to a minimum because you can be destroying people's lives by saying that they're potentially a killer, potentially this, potentially that, when a decade later you find out that it was just a horrible coincidence that all these things led up to him leaving, and then you tried to make his son out to have killed him. That is horrible. And I
or maybe
really
not
hope
killed him, or maybe had some type of connection to his death.
Exactly. And it's no, it's the complete opposite of what you all thought. So all of your 30 pages of wild threads that you have out there about the Sandy Hook connection that you believe
oh my God, yeah, I forgot
is
about
possible. That. And, this connection to Max and all this stuff. It's no, this guy left.
Right.
He made the cognitive decision to say, I'm leaving.
I think that even we, prior to the realization of what happened, I think that we never really had the idea that Max had anything to do with his father's disappearance or death. It was more, could Hoagie have been a victim due to Max's actions and the life that he had been living with the drug addiction and how your life can kind of spiral out of control through that. But I think that what you said about you need to watch your speculation or keep your speculation to a minimum, especially at the beginning of an investigation, or even if an investigation has been going on for an extended amount of time, it comes down to reviewing evidence and speculating within reason. You need to be able to say, it's like if you have, an anonymous source comes forward with information and they say such and such happened. Well, you need to corroborate that information with another source that can say the same thing. You can't just be like, oh, yeah, Max must have did this because he's a drug addict.
Exactly.
Like,
you need to have, there was some random, spot of blood in his car or like something.
Or he had an injury on him,
He was scratched or, you have to tie those things together to say, okay, someone's bringing this to my attention. What else can I take that I know within this investigation to connect to that to see if this theory is plausible?
Fact-based speculation, I think, is good. But also you want to be able to you don't want to like shut people off from being able to speculate, because oftentimes speculation within reason can help bring new leads into the case. And on top of that, you'd have to be extremely naive to believe that police don't speculate and investigators don't speculate. That's the whole way that they get through things. But all of that speculation is, again, fact-based. And also, I guess you use anecdotal evidence because when you're an investigator, there are patterns to crime. So if you have had something similar happen in a previous investigation, it's not outlandish to think, okay, something similar could have happened here. But where you were talking about how all these people are like, oh, Max must have been involved. Max probably had something to do with his father's death, and it was proven to not be the case. And there was really no evidence to believe that in the first place because there was no struggle ever found. Max wasn't injured. I think that what happened with Max being thrown under the bus is very similar to, I know we keep talking about it because it's a huge case right now going on, but it has to do with the Idaho murders and how people are just coming out and saying the most outlandish things. Like even on the news, was it Defense Diaries posted that clip?
Oh, of the guy talking about the
guy
father?
Talking about the father and saying something to the effect of, I've never seen such a guilty-looking person before.
Yeah, talking about Kaylee's father.
Right.
Like, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that if you're speculating in your own mind or your own small circles and you're trying to use fact-based evidence or anecdotal evidence based on similar circumstances that you or other investigators have been intimately involved with before, I think that's okay. But when you start just slandering people over the internet with no evidence...
It's worse than that. For example, very recently, as I was scrolling Twitter, because of course it's all over Twitter, there is currently a plea to the public for a white Hyundai Elantra that authorities believe has pertinent information to the case. I don't know.
Or somebody that was the owner or operator of that vehicle would have information?
Correct. I believe that car was like in the vicinity that night around the time that the murders occurred. And there was apparently an Elantra that was like left somewhere and it had like front end damage or something in a neighboring state. And of course, any white Hyundai Elantra is going to be scrutinized, and the web sleuths and the armchair detectives are reaching out to police to say, oh, there was this car. Oh, there was that car. Look into this, blah, blah, blah. But I saw that this particular car that they're talking about, authorities had to literally say to the public, stop trying to contact the owner of the vehicle. Guys, let them do their jobs. Right. Holy crap. That is ridiculous.
Yeah, borderline harassment at that point. I wonder what they're trying to say to this vehicle owner.
Probably harassing them like, did you have something to do with this or whatever? Right. People do not need that. Because you can take the Delphi case as a perfect example of people thinking, this person was involved, that person was involved, must have been this, must have been that. And then the person that ends up arrested who allegedly committed this crime is not anybody that anyone has ever heard of.
Right.
So you need to, in some cases, back up, let police do their jobs.
Especially when it's an active investigation like that.
They're acting like police aren't doing their jobs the way they're supposed to. You don't just have the Moscow Police Department involved in this. You have state police. You have the FBI.
Right.
You have the big dogs in here working on this case. And I get that it's frustrating. If it were me, if it were my loved one, I would be pissed right off that this killer had not been apprehended yet.
Right, but the agencies that are investigating this case are under so much scrutiny. They get the light shining right on them. The best thing that you can do is be a good witness and pass that information along to authorities because you've got to think. If you had to bet on it, whether or not they're taking your information and looking into it or just throwing it in the bin, they're probably looking into it because, although I have my own opinion on whether or not they're being truthful with what they know, they still need help. They haven't made an arrest. So if they put out, a plea to the public, say, hey, we need information on a white Elantra, and you give them information on a white Elantra, they're probably going to look into it.
Well, and yeah, they're looking through 22,000 registered white Elantras in however much vicinity of the area.
Right.
They probably already know about the one that you're calling in about, and they don't need you reaching out to the owner of that car.
Right. Imagine if you have the right person, and maybe the person that owns that Elantra is the suspect, and by you going to harass them, they flee the area and they disappear. You have now just destroyed that investigation. Take the information you know, pass it on to investigators, and continue to contact them to see if they followed up on your information.
Exactly.
Don't take the law into your own hands. Don't take the investigation into your own hands. If you're doing research, that's one thing, but when you start contacting people that may be persons of interest or suspects in an investigation, you're now, putting yourself up on the chopping block for being charged for obstructing their investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we totally got off topic there, but, I just think that's...
It's unscripted. It's an update episode, so...
Yes, exactly. So I'm sure you guys understand this is very conversational, and we're probably going off on multiple tangents that we normally wouldn't in a regular episode. But yeah, I think just overall, both of these cases that have now been solved, it gives us hope. And, even if we have nothing to do with it, the fact that we're talking about these people, we're keeping their names in the public eye, and, hopefully we see more of these cases getting solved. I'm like, all right, what cases am I going to pick now? I had, a couple people reach out. They're like, so can I give you a couple cases to cover that we really want solved? I know, it's just a joke, but I just hope to see more of these cases getting solved. And I feel like I have this feeling that 2023 is going to be this big year for solved cases, for DNA, for identified does, all these people getting their names back, monsters being put in prison or being kept in prison. And, this was something that me and Dawn from Method and Madness were just talking about recently. She said, I just envision these murderers, these horrible people sitting in their homes, shaking in their boots, just waiting for the knock on the door. And that's exactly what I feel like too. And I just hope that more cases continue to get solved. And we can come to you with more updates too.
Yeah, and it's important to cover the unsolved cases because much like us, you have all these Google alerts on. You got to assume that investigators that are looking into these cold cases and these unsolved cases, they have these same alerts on. So when you finally have, a podcast or a YouTube channel cover something that hasn't been covered in an extended amount of time, that pops up and they're like, oh, maybe I can use the momentum of these content creators who just produced this episode, work off them and, maybe put out some more info. Now that more people are in the know about what had happened and want to know more answers. Yeah. So even if it's a total coincidence that these two cases, had closure so quickly after we released our episodes, it's still beneficial to cover unsolved cases and get people thinking about them and talking about them.
Yeah, I agree. And just side note, something that I wanted to mention earlier that slipped out of my mind and just came back now had to do with our conversation in part 2 about Hoagie's case and how, when you have tunnel vision on a case, and I sat here for hours and hours on end researching this and kind of coming to my own conclusion, and then John and I sitting here having this conversation and he's bringing up things that didn't even come into my mind. It makes me believe that us having these conversations could potentially be beneficial to law enforcement because for all you know, they've been working on this case for decades and they have tunnel vision on it and they're not thinking outside the box and they just need a fresh set of eyes. And there could be something that we mention that triggers a thought in their mind to say, wait a second, we didn't think about that or we didn't look down that path. And then I think it just goes to show that you can have a one-track mind on things and think something and someone can bring something else up and then it changes it all.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes with these cases that have gone unsolved for, years or decades, the case has changed hands so many times. Different investigators, somebody retires, passes it on to the next detective and the next detective. And whereas they might be reviewing these cases and looking through the case file and trying to reach out and contact people that may still be alive or persons of interest or whatever, trying to track down a lead, you don't know if they're working with any other officers on this, bouncing different ideas off each other, or if they're just kind of looking at the case file and kind of going from there. So giving credit to what you just said, sometimes, giving this information out or people covering this information, you may ask a question that somebody else didn't think about or something that was glossed over in a case folder that now when you say it again kind of clicks in somebody's head that's working on that investigation and maybe, reignites the case, maybe not necessarily gives them a new lead to work, but, gives them a renewed vigor at least to try and get more done.
Yeah, I agree completely. And having said a lot about how talking about and looking into unsolved cases can be more beneficial than we may realize, I think Uncovered deserves a quick plug. If you have an interest in unsolved cases, head over to uncovered.com, where you can become a member of a growing community of like-minded individuals who have a passion for gathering information and helping others. Now, this is where we had planned to end the episode, having recorded prior to the release of a very important message. But having some extra time before release, we feel as though it would be a disservice to Hoagie's story and to his remaining family to not add in this next part. So, before we conclude today's episode, I want to read a letter titled Regarding Robert Hoagland, published in the Newtown Bee, signed by the Hoagland family, which gives some much-needed clarity and a sense of finality to this whole story. The letter reads, quote, "Not quite 10 years ago, my husband, the father of our 3 boys, disappeared without a trace. It felt like the world had spun off its axis. Me and my boys were broken, each of us left to create a narrative to a story we might never fully understand, but one we could ultimately live with. For nearly 10 years, that is what we did. Last Tuesday, December 6th, an extraordinary thing happened. We learned that my husband, the father of our 3 sons, had spent those 10 years living under an assumed name in a small town not far from here. We were also told he had recently died. We were blindsided, unexpectedly and punishingly plunged back down the rabbit hole we had worked so hard for years to climb from. Miraculously, though, along with this stunning news came 2 gifts, a journal and a set of rings, his wedding band, which was found on his nightstand, and a silver ring, a gift from his son Max, which he was still wearing when he died. The journal had been written during the first few weeks of his journey, away from the people he loved toward his new life. In it, he explains his need to escape the violence surrounding us and the lack of political action spurred, he felt, by greed, selfishness, and materialism. His need to go back to the simplicity of nature. His wish for us all, as humans, to live more fully in kindness and love. He apologizes to us, his family, deeply and mournfully, and page after page he pleads his love for each of us by name, as if a mantra. He writes to each of us directly of his hopes and dreams for our futures. He specifically says this choice was not any of our fault. He believes we will be strong enough to survive this. He believes we can forgive him. Though this new chapter has unbalanced us, my boys and I are strong. Our strength is powered by all of you. We have been and continue to be lucky to be lifted by your kindness and outpouring of love. This is our story and ours alone, and it ends here. But the healing continues, and forgiveness for some has already come, and for others will come in time. In the meantime, strive to be kind. Gratefully, the Hoagland family. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.